This week we learned about basic botany, and basic botany covered the very general things we needed to know about how a plant grows and lives, how it transports nutrients and water, and etc. So again, we're just going to flip through the course and see what kind of highlights we can talk about for this week's class. Now, as we got into basic botany, we started learning a lot of Latin terms, and I gotta tell you, I don't know about you, but I didn't learn Latin growing up, and because of that, for some reason, I have a very difficult time pronouncing some of these words. So expect me to put up on the screen here what I'm trying to pronounce so that you can look it up and not have to guess what in the world this little southern boy in the United States tried to say. So we started by just learning about the different parts of the plant. We learned about the major plant phalia. We learned about roots and stems, how photosynthesis, respiration, transpiration, and reproduction work. And then we talked about common names, scientific names, and taxonomy. So, one of the things we learned about was Pinophyta. Pinophytas are plants that do not have true flowers. The seeds are not enclosed in the fruits, and most of the seeds are produced in cones. Your Pinophytas include things like pines, junipers, and cypress. We learned about Magnoliophyta, which do produce flowers, and they develop fruits that contain seeds. And inside of those, we learned about the dicots, which have two-seed leaves, or cotyledons. And we learned about the xylem and the phloem parts of the stems. One interesting identifying characteristics of these groups of plants is that the leaves are usually net-veined. That's probably a good point to make about this class. A lot of it was about identification, how in using basic botany understanding that we can help a client identify what a plant actually is, or how we can identify the plant if somebody just brings us a cutting or a piece of a plant. We also learned about the monocots, or those plants that produce only one seed leaf, how the xylem and phloem are different and are paired in bundles inside of the stems of these plants, and that the leaves are long and narrow with parallel veins as opposed to having net veins as with the dicots. We learned about all the different types of roots, tap roots and fibrous roots. We learned about how roots develop, how they take up nutrients, and how they grow. We learned about the different tissues that are in a root and how they affect the growth of the plant and the root itself. Probably the most interesting thing we talked about specifically in the root section, it does not apply just to roots, but this is where we were first introduced to it, was the cambium. This is a layer of the cells inside of a plant where growing takes place. This is where new phloem and xylem are actually produced. So these are those indeterminate cells that are just now growing that are eventually going to grow into something else to perform a specific function. So what's all that phloem and xylem stuff about? Well, the phloem's primary purpose is to distribute the photosynthate sugar from the leaves to the rest of the plant. So generally, the phloem is a downward motion from the leaves throughout the rest of the plant. The xylem, on the other hand, is what facilitates the transport of water and nutrients from the roots up to the rest of the plant. Those xylem fibers are also what help provide the structural support to the plant. We continued to learn about stems, the different types of stems, how they grow. We learned about different parts of how a plant produces itself, such as the stolons or the runners. A good example of a stolon are the runners that you see coming out of a strawberry plant, reaching over to root itself again so that it can make another strawberry plant. It's a stolon. We learned about spurs and bulbs and corms and rhizomes and tubers and so many other different parts of the plant. We learned some more details about the leaves. We got to see some cross-section of leaves and learn about how it transpires air, how it takes in CO2, and how the photosynthesis process takes place. One thing that I found particularly interesting, something that makes a lot of sense once you've heard it, but maybe you've never really taken the time to think about in the first place, was how a plant transpires, how it takes water from the roots up the stem and then transpires that water out through the leaves. And it does that transpiration through the leaves out of what's called a stoma. And the thing that you wouldn't maybe think about is the difference in plants and how many stomata they actually have. What they explain to us is that in a tropical climate, the plants that are adapted to that region are going to have more stomates, whereas in desert plants, they're going to have less stomates. And that's an interesting thing to think about. But when you think about it, it makes a lot of sense. Those hot, humid areas, those plants need to really breathe and take in that water and let it out. But in a desert climate, they're going to want to retain as much of that moisture as they can, and they don't need as many stomates to get the job done, which I think was particularly interesting. We also got to talk a good deal about sex in this part of the class. We talked about the stamens and pistils and different parts of a flower and how plants actually reproduce. And what was interesting was about how a plant knows when it's time to reproduce. We talked about the different sensitivities plants have, that they recognize day length or they recognize temperature. And it was a pretty interesting thing to learn about how some plants are looking just for the temperature, other plants are looking just for the day length. And it makes a lot of sense because you can have times where a plant starts to recognize a certain day length and it flowers, it starts to bloom, but then we have a late frost. And just because the daylight was there, the temperature wasn't, and things sort of fell backwards. We did learn about plants that also are day neutral, things like tomatoes, cucumbers, and roses, whose flowering is not affected at all by the day length. Last but not least, we talked about the plant naming system and taxonomy. And this to me is a bit of a gray area because on one hand, we're being told that we need to understand the scientific names, the botanical names, the Latin names behind these plants, and that we should be using those Latin names because they're more specific. We can know exactly what kind of plant we're talking about if we're using the scientific names. To me, the scientific names have a value and a use to them, but I think too many times they're used in a way that's snobby. I think sometimes people flaunt that they know the scientific name, where everybody in the world just wants to say pine tree. Somebody wants to pop out a 4-name long taxonomy on exactly what kind of pine tree that is. There's times where it's necessary so that we can be clear on what we're talking about. But I think that generally speaking, for me, you're better off using the common names and then bringing up the scientific names if there's something that calls a question. The last thing we very generally covered was the difference between annuals, biennials, and perennials, and just what those terms mean. We sort of delve into that later in the course in a little greater detail. And I think that those terms are probably more generic than anything else. People know them. They're more commonplace. So we really didn't delve into them too much. So there you have it. Basic botany. The basic understanding on what a plant is composed of, and how it produces its food, how it takes up its nutrients, and how to make sure it has an environment that's conducive to do that. Thank you all for watching. We'll see you next time.